But all I really know what to talk about is my own life as a mom, especially right now. I thought I'd talk a little bit about my journey as a mom. Most of you who know us know that we have 5 children. And we also have a beautiful daughter-in-law and a handsome son-in-law and 8 amazing grandchildren. They're all a great blessing to us. Our oldest is Nicole, and she's given us 6 of our grandchildren: Tyler, Leanna, Anthony, Desiree, Aiden, and Mikey. Then there's Ben and his wife Jen, and they have one adorable little 2-year-old girl named Ruby June. And then Aaron, who's still single. And then there's Alyssa, who's married to Stephen. And they have a little beautiful little girl who's 17 months. Alyssa had a twin sister who sadly passed away during labor due to a complication. That was a real difficult time for us, as you can imagine. But we know that we'll see her one day when we're all in heaven together. Her name was Johanna Lynn. And then there's David. My story this morning is mostly about him. Being his caregiver has become a huge part of my life. David is 30 years old, and he has special needs. When I was pregnant with him, we expected a normal, healthy baby. But David was not at all what we expected. God was taking us on a different path. Shortly after he was born, the doctor told us that David appeared to have Down syndrome. He pointed out some of his features that indicated this. He had low-set ears, he had the folds in his eyes, and the shape of his hands. At first, we didn't believe this. He looked perfectly normal to us. He was a beautiful little boy. At one point, one of the hospital staff suggested to my husband that we should institutionalize him. Of course, Mark said, "No way. We're taking him home. He's our son. He's coming home with us." But before we took him home, a cardiologist told us that he had a hole in his heart that allowed blood to flow through the chambers of his heart. But he also told us the hole was very small, and they expected that it would close by itself, and that we shouldn't worry. So we took him home, and we tried not to worry. His Down syndrome was eventually confirmed by a geneticist, but we already were starting to see signs that things were different with David. As the first few weeks progressed, David seemed to be not doing so well, not eating much. Sorry. He became so sick with respiratory distress at 4 weeks old that we had to take him to the hospital, where he was admitted and eventually, after 2 weeks, placed on a ventilator. An echocardiogram confirmed that the hole in his heart had not closed, and this was causing his illness. He had to have surgery right away. We had to take him, well, actually, he flew in a helicopter to Boston Children's Hospital because his condition was so serious. He had his heart repaired at Boston Children's at 8 weeks old, almost exactly 30 years ago, a day or two after Mother's Day. I stayed with my sister, who lived in Boston at the time, and Mark stayed in Boston long enough for the surgery, and then he went home to be with our children. David came through the surgery fine, which was several hours long, and he had to be on a heart-lung machine. The next day was a different story. During the surgery, they had placed a line in his artery, his aorta, to measure the pressure. When they removed the line, his aorta ruptured. This caused his blood pressure to drop drastically, and he was bleeding internally and needed his aorta repaired right away. They couldn't do it right away. It was several hours and several transfusions later that he was finally taken back to the OR. And they had to open his chest several times before they could get him to stop bleeding. His blood wasn't clotting due to all the transfusions. This happened late at night, and they told us he wasn't sure he was going to make it through the night. My sister and I were alone. Mark had already gone back home, not expecting anything like this to happen. It was the worst night of our lives, not knowing whether David was going to live or die. We had all the church family, Pastor and Linda, and everyone in the church prayed for him, our extended family and friends. And by the grace of God, he survived the night. We had to stay in Boston for about 2 more weeks until he was stable enough to come back to Hartford Hospital, where he had several months of recovery and intensive care. Still on a ventilator and heavily sedated. He needed a few more minor surgeries before he was ready to go home. It became eventually evident that the bleeding out incident had left him with cerebral palsy and severe developmental delays. He came home finally in late October, about 7 months after he was admitted. It was an incredible miracle that he had survived at all, after all that he went through. He came home with a tracheostomy and a gastrostomy tube, and he needed nursing care at home for several months and frequent hospital and ER visits. But by God's grace and the prayers and support of our extended family and our church family, David survived, and so did we. We had so much help from the people in church, and my mom especially helped with the other children, because I had to spend a lot of time at the hospital during those months. God has remained faithful to me as a mom through the many years we've been caring for David. Although his health has improved over the years, the challenges with his special needs were and are ongoing. He needs help with every aspect of his life: dressing, feeding, bathing. He can't do anything on his own. The challenges are getting greater as he ages and we age, and David's needs and behaviors are changing too. But God has always been there, even when I felt so discouraged and feel like I can't do this another day. Somehow, God always shows me that I have his strength, that he's provided, and that I can go on. We've learned to appreciate the little things that David can do and the simple things that make him happy. He loves to spend time with his dad, watching him work on his trucks or whatever he's doing, sitting in the sun, even just putting him in his bed at night. He loves his bed. He gets really excited and he laughs. I get fearful sometimes, wondering what the future will bring for him and for us. But we know that God has it all in his hands. Having David in our lives has changed our family in many ways. I see our children and our grandchildren having very compassionate and caring hearts. And it's encouraging to see how they love David and participate in his care whenever they can. As difficult as it is to care for David at times, it's harder still to see him get frustrated because he can't communicate his wants and needs or do the things that he wants to do. We wonder frequently why God allows such suffering. I know many of us, a lot of people here in the church, are suffering and struggling in different ways. Every one of us struggles at some point in our lives. Some have lost loved ones. Some struggle with illness or pain on a daily basis. Some struggle with their finances. And some being a caregiver to someone that can't care for themselves. There is this promise in Romans 8:28 that says, all things work together for good for those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Maybe those things, the sufferings that we endure, are good in that they help us to conform to the image of his Son. In some way, we're sharing in his suffering on the cross. Maybe the purpose is to use that to help someone else. I'd like to quote something that Beth Moore wrote that might help when we're tempted to wallow in the mire of our circumstances. She said, "Christ got down next to us in the grave, stayed the better part of 3 days, and then got up. So we'd have permission to get up too and start living life. Beloved, let this one sink in deeply. If God allowed you to be thrown in a pit, you weren't picked on, you were picked out. God entrusted that suffering to you because he has faith in you. Live up to it, all the way up." I'm not sure yet why God has given us this particular challenge in our lives. We may never know in this life, but at times I see glimpses of his grace and glory in the midst of it. In closing, I'd like to mention my own mom. She's now suffering with Alzheimer's, and most times there's days she doesn't know who her children and grandchildren are, or her husband. She will usually know that we're someone that she knows, but can't make the connection. She was also the mom of a special needs child. My sister's name was Christina Lynn. She was born with a condition called hydrocephalus, which is fluid that collects around the brain, causing pressure to build. It caused her head to become very large during development in the womb. This was 50 years ago, so there was no ultrasound, so no one knew that there was a problem. My mother and the baby almost died during the delivery. Chrissy's condition caused her terrible headaches and seizures, and she also had very severe developmental delays. She required multiple hospitalizations and surgeries during her short life. She died of pneumonia when she was 5. My parents kept her home as long as they possibly could until she became much too difficult to care for at home. They placed her in a special facility, and I remember how heartbreaking it was for my mom to leave her there. Those years were very difficult for the family, but there were also moments of joy as she would crack a beautiful, rare little smile. What I remember most was the way that lives were touched by my parents' care for her, and the testimony of God's grace and love through it all, and how it affected my own life and the lives of my sisters. I see it now as a time of preparation for what I'm experiencing now. How seeing my mom handle her life with grace and commitment. I remember seeing her so exhausted, sometimes because she was awake all night with Chrissy when she was screaming in pain. I don't remember ever hearing her complain about her circumstances. My parents knew she was a gift from God, although they never knew why God allowed her suffering. They prayed for healing and for her and hoped for a miracle, never seeing it in this life. But they never wavered in their faith. I am so grateful for the legacy of faith that they gave me. And I hope and pray that I can leave the same legacy for my own children and grandchildren. I pray for them daily that God would have his hand on them, protecting them and drawing them to him, and that we would see them with us in the kingdom. God bless you all, moms and grandmas. I just have one verse. This has been my verse that's been my theme through the year. It's from Isaiah 26, verses 3 and 4. It may be familiar to you. The steadfast of heart he will keep in perfect peace because he trusts in you. Trust in the Lord forever, for in God the Lord we have an everlasting rock. Thank you.